All right, let's do it. My Life in Letters. Really excited and humbled today to have one of the illest out there, East from ATT, DF fame. I know you're in Denver right now. It's an honor, man. And I just can't thank you enough for taking the time out to chop it up with us.
Well, thanks for the invite.
Hell yeah, man. And I'm trying to get as many of the friends that I have that are OGs that have a lot of pedigree, and have the history in this culture. And you're right there, at the, top of the pile for guys that have been around for a long time and have been consistent. And we try to take it back to really early days to kind of find out what small things were that kind of sparked people's interest in this subculture that we're all a part of and that we created. Yep. Are you originally from the Midwest? I know when I met you in the 90s, you were a, Midwest cat. Is that where you're from?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, I was born in Hammond, Indiana, which is probably just a rock's throw outside of South Chicago, and then, really cut my teeth in Chicago proper. So yeah, definitely from the Midwest.
This is My Life in Letters, and I like to try to ask people what their very first experience or kind of first understanding of lettering was, and sort of the power of it. And I wonder for you, what was that? What was the first, experience for you, be it handwriting in school, or first time you realized sort of the utility and power of letter?
Yeah, it's tough to pinpoint being so far back. I just remember, I was heavily involved in the b-boy scene, going to clubs and ciphering quite a bit. And just that, that whole part of that subculture had me seeking out albums and magazine articles and newspaper clippings and anything I could get my hands on. And just naturally doing those things, I would come across album covers from, different guys out of New York, whether it be Stash and Futura. Those guys had some of the older ones that I remember most vividly.
Yeah.
And, in articles and stuff like that about b-boying, always had guys posing in the Bronx and, handball courts full of graffiti behind them, so that always, kind of cemented itself in my brain.
Were you exposed to all this hip hop culture in Hammond, Indiana?
Oh, yeah. Oh gosh, yeah. Indiana, it seems so far and so podunk when you consider, when you talk about Chicago. But where I grew up when I was really young in Indiana is considered what's called Chicagoland, which is the greater Chicago area. So all of our radio stations, all of our news channels, all of our sports teams are all exactly the same as the city. Mm-hmm. And literally, if I drove 20 minutes to, East Chicago, where notorious crews for the Midwest and the Chicago area, Hitman Kisa and G-Force and stuff like that, these crews that were doing big things back in the 80s, it was really kind of the same culture that you would find in Chicago proper. There was a lot of graffiti. There was a lot of b-boying and DJs. There was heavy gang activity. All these things were synonymous with hip-hop and b-boying and the graffiti culture growing up in Chicago and the Chicagoland area. So I never really had to go far to experience that. Mm-hmm. Luckily, if I had been really far southern Indiana away from the Chicago coast or something, I probably would have had more trouble. But there was a lot of exposure and a lot of things that were readily available to me because I was so close to the, Chicagoland area.
Yeah. And so I didn't know that Hammond was that close. So it's like a 20-minute drive basically to get near the city. Were you always an Indiana kid even when you started hanging out in Chicago, or was it because you were so close, did the proximity help you feel more like a native?
Well, I consider myself a native Chicagoan. I'm not a native-born Chicagoan. I was born in Hammond. But, when I was really young, I went to, preschool and middle school in Evanston, which is a north suburb of Chicago. And, I came from, like many people, broken family. Divorced parent, and they divorced when I was 2. And my mother, in order to make enough money to sustain a family, she worked in Chicago, even though we lived in Indiana. So she commuted every day. And my aunt lived there. So, during the summers, I would live with my aunt. I was constantly commuting back and forth from one parent to the other. So, even though I'm from Indiana and was born in Indiana, so much of my youth was spent in Evanston and Chicago and Rogers Park growing up. So I always consider myself a native because that's really where I grew up. And, and when I became old enough to, I guess, identify my own being, my own persona, was in Chicago at the time. When I was making my own decisions and creating my own life experiences, I did it all when I lived in Chicago. So, yeah, I consider myself a Chicago native, regardless of the fact that I was actually born
outside. That's awesome. And that's exactly what I was trying to get at. I think that's so cool. And you were saying that, like, even in Hammond, there was, like, exposure to hip-hop because it was so close to Chicago. So I'm curious, like, because hip-hop seems to be, like, it's played a big role in your life and in your career, what was your first dose of it? How did you first come across it?
Yeah, I came across hip-hop because, well, one, my family, we're all very musical. We don't play musical instruments, but we're all just very musical. We've always danced or whatever. So music was always a big part of our household. And, disco and soul and all of that stuff was always playing in the house. And, when the first disco records and the first rap records started to come out that had, like Blondie had rapping on her album. And then obviously the Sugar Hill Gang dropped in like 79. Like all those things were big hits on the radio, and immediately I was drawn to those because that's all we really listened to was funk, classic rock, soul, and disco in the house. So immediately I was drawn to it that way. But then also as a kid, we were poor. We didn't have cars. So we took the bus, the subway, or walked everywhere. And as graffiti was coming into, its own and becoming prolific around the city, I was right there with it.
And
like I saw it all.
What year was that? What year was that, like, that really starting to take shape?
Probably 81 to 83 is when it really started to really pop off. And it wasn't even all just graffiti as we might identify it today with crews and letters and tags.
Sure.
There were a lot of rooftops that had these giant ornate roller patterns in white on them. And I'm not even sure who this artist was, but they would do these giant elaborate white roller patterns and designs all over rooftops. And then there were stencil artists who did clothespins and stencils of ants all over the place.
That's
and
awesome.
Of course, there was always Trust Jesus. Trust Jesus was everywhere. I mean, not even in my city. Everybody can say that they have a Trust Jesus story. There was Trust Jesus in every city.
Yeah, totally.
All that stuff was everywhere. Plus, gang graffiti has been so prominent in Chicago since probably the 60s that was always there as well. And, all of those things helped create the Chicago hip-hop scene. It was very rare that you ever had anybody involved in any aspect of hip-hop as a kid who wasn't in some way, shape, or form affiliated with a gang, be it by choice or not by choice.
Right.
Many times you just had to affiliate yourself anyway just to get around your neighborhood and to be able to get up.
Sure. And in 81, so were you seeing those gangs just in Chicago, or were they also in Indiana?
No, they were in Indiana too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for sure. The hitmen, I would go hang out with the hitmen in East Chicago. You were always on full alert. There was a lot of folk and a lot of Cobras and Kings, if I recall right, all over in East Chicago. And, the guys I hung out with, Rooster and all those guys in the Hitmen, just by default, most of them were affiliated with folk.
How did you make that first connection to the Hitmen in Chicago? How did that happen?
That happened, really by accident. In about 1983, I moved back in with my mom, who was she kept moving around Chicago, and finally she settled in an area, they call it Streeterville. Right by Marina Towers, it's downtown, it's off of State Street. And there was a art store, I'm going to say maybe 8 blocks away from it. But I didn't realize it at the time. When I moved there in 83, I was kind of just walking the city or whatever, and still traveling to and from Evanston to visit my aunt a lot. Mm-hmm. But in 84, I discovered this art store called Sheldon's by walking around, and all the signage in the window was all graffiti related. I could tell just by the handwriting and everything else that it was being done by a graffiti writer. So I went in, poked around, asked a few questions, and that's where I met the Chicago legend, Feski Fes, who I believe he was just leaving ACW. Maybe he was ACW, not ABC, excuse me. He was leaving ACW to start his own crew, ONC, one-man crew, and just going out on his own. And anyway, in 84, I discovered that there was a graffiti writer working at an art store and within walking distance from where I was living with my mom. So then I started spending a lot of time there.
So Feski Fes, is that what you said?
Yeah, Feski Fes. It's Fesski, Fess.
Feski. And so that dude is from Chicago, but he's working at this art store. How did that go down? Did you just like walk up and find him and say, hey, you're the guy that did the signs in the window? Or how did you like make your connection to him? Just walking in?
Oh, immediately I walked in and, I was a little apprehensive about just asking about graffiti or whatever.
Yeah.
So I went over to a kiosk of magazines and books that were all about typography. So it's all these lettering books, and I just started sifting through them. But the whole time I'm sifting through these lettering books, I'm looking up, I'm looking around or whatever, and Feski took notice of me. So then he came over and he started talking about the books and how they're really great for his, his drawings and his lettering and everything else. And then he asked me right out if I was a writer. And I said, yeah. I said, I actually came in because I noticed that there was a bunch of graffiti on the ads on the window. And he's like, yeah, I did those on Feski Fes. And that's where I met him.
Nice. How old were you in 84?
I was kind of trying to, play it low key and see what, feel my way around or whatever. But he came to me and he's the one who asked me if I was a writer.
And in 84, how old were you?
84, I was 15.
And so you told him you were a writer. Had you already been kind of dabbling with some graffiti?
Oh yeah. I'd already destroyed my dad's garage and my entire room in the basement.
Nice.
I'd been arrested in the town that my dad lived in.
Oh dang! Oh wow. Okay. So,
the best part is he's a county cop, or was. He's deceased now, but he was a county cop, so everybody knew him. And here his kid's getting pulled in for practicing his tags and everything else on what was the old courthouse for the city, but had been turned into a city monument and a museum.
You bombed the museum.
I had broken out the windows and crawled into the basement of the place and tagged up old jail cells. And oh my God, dude, it was a mess.
So hold on. So that's what I was trying to get to that earlier. So then now let's take you back. So you're 15 when you meet Feski Fes, but when did you first put a tag together? When did that first happen? And that's what I was asking earlier about your first experience with like lettering. Like, I guess I was kind of getting to that. Like, what was your first experience with graffiti and an understanding of what it was, let alone that you wanted to do it? But what were your earliest understandings of graph?
I'd like to claim that I understood what I was doing. And when I started scribbling on stuff, that was probably 82, but I didn't. The first time I actually even wrote on anything, despite the fact that I had already been exposed to graffiti through b-boying, magazine articles, whatever, record albums. Mm-hmm. It was a dare from this kid who, on my 13th birthday, said, let's go steal some spray paint at this local hobby store. So that's what we did. And then we went around the corner into the alley, and we just started scribbling stuff. I didn't even have a real tag. I wrote my b-boy name, which was Sir Chill.
Nice.
I did this little whack, like stick figure breakdance dude on the wall and wrote Sir Chill with like this really shitty glare on it, without even really knowing what I was doing.
That's fresh though.
But I knew I was having fun,
Yeah.
I was immediately addicted and drawn to it, so I just kept doing it. But I can't even say that until I met Feski and he really started to put me into structure and a direction that I knew really what I was doing. But I had already been writing before him by, at least a couple years.
And do you remember some of the other guys because I'm just presuming that you were seeing other older dudes or guys your age that were doing graffiti. Like, who were you looking at in 82, 83 before Feski Fes to like, for inspiration for letters or bars or whatever it was, tags? Who was standing out back then?
I saw a lot of Futura 2000.
And that was via album covers and magazines?
Yeah, I still have one of the original clippings, too, of Futura 2000 that I kept.
Nice.
I saw Futura 2000 stuff. I saw Phase, not Phase 2, but Phase, F-A-Z-E. He was out of another borough outside of New York. Who else did I see? Of course, like Taki and all the typical Stitch One type tags. And I can't even say necessarily that it was Stitch One. I know I saw Taki, Top Cat, things like that. But just all of those, that whole flood of names and numbers that everybody seemed to have at that time. K161 and John 151 and 156. And, the list goes on.
Yeah.
All that stuff was prominent in the background and on these handball courts of all the photographs that I had stolen out of magazines or newspaper clippings.
When did you first start b-boying? Because you said that the b-boying had hit, that was first, right? Before you started doing graffiti.
I started b-boying first. I was b-boying around 78, 79.
And that was in Indiana.
Yeah. Well, that was a mix of Indiana and Chicago.
Because you were already traveling back and forth at that point.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, my dad moved. He rented, so he moved every single year. So as soon as his lease was up, he moved.
Mm-hmm.
And among that, throughout those years, I would also be moving back and forth between my aunts in Evanston, my mom in Chicago, and my dad wherever he was living in Indiana.
Mm-hmm.
So timelines are always nonstop blurs, and they're so choppy that you can't say I was here at this specific time and was exposed to this with any kind of real precision.
Yeah, and it's one of the things
that's way too chaotic.
It's one of the things that's kind of been a driver for me to do this podcast is to start to sort some of this stuff out, because there's a lot of importance, to these little early things that happen, and it's so easy for us to have forgotten them, I mean, we have to make. Apex said it the other day, to make room for other stuff, you have to forget things, and I was like, yeah, I think that's kind of true. But so we're trying to pull back and get it on tape, So 78, you're b-boying, and so that's interesting, right? Because if you're b-boying in 78, then you're getting the taste of the graffiti because it was just associated with the whole thing. So for 6 years, actually, before you meet Feski Fes, you have this understanding. Did you have a name when you met Feski Fes? Because you weren't doing Mr. Sir Chill at that point, I presume, right? What were you writing?
Well, yeah, I mean, as far as B-boy names go, I went from Sir Chill to one even worse it was Playboy, because I had these they had these really bad knockoff Chuck Taylors with a Playboy bunny on them.
Oh my goodness.
My name's Playboy.
Dude.
And then my first actual graffiti name was Graphics with an X, Grafix 102. And, all these guys had numbers after their names, but I didn't have an understanding as to why. I didn't realize it was their address or it was the block that they lived on. I just wanted something that sounded good at the end of graphics, so I put 102.
Graphics 102.
And
nice.
It had no substantial meaning whatsoever.
It's a good name, though. So no one gave that to you? You just grabbed that out of thin air and threw the 102?
I grabbed graphics out of thin air, yeah. And I'm sure I probably saw it in an art store, and I changed the PHICS to an FIX, whatever, just whatever dumb kid shit.
And was that dumb kid shit purely tags, or had you started to put together some letters, like some throw ups or bubble letters or straight letters or anything?
Strictly tags and bubble letters. There was not much structure going on yet at that time. I don't think I even really put any kind of real structure together until 85 or 86.
Okay. So when you meet Feski, and actually I don't know anything about him. So will you tell us a little bit about him? What was his thing? Did he have ill bombing styles? Did he have pieces? What was he all about?
Well, he was a b-boy, and he was about typography and font. He had done a lot of wild styles when he was with ACW. He had done a lot of bombing and a lot of pieces. And what stuck out to him the most through his already, short but prolific career in Chicago was all of the simple stuff that when you're flying by on the L train that you can read from a distance and see it the whole time you're riding, and it sticks with you. Everyone wants to do that dope wild style, but you see it coming, but it's just a big glob of color until you get just close enough to finally catch what it might say, and then by that time you're already past it.
Yeah, but you're saying that Feski was doing sort of more typography, straight letters, real legible stuff from a distance.
Yeah.
Nice.
So he was all about doing big fonts and big symbols, and he was really into typography, and he really preached typography. He still liked to do a lot of wild styles. His wild styles, though, became more abstract, a lot of integration of bubbles into the letters and noodly style lettering.
Nice.
That was indicative really just to him at the time, because a lot of other people were still trying to, make more structured, I guess, New York-esque type of graffiti, but not Feski. Feski always seemed to be somewhat off to the side and on his own and an out-of-box thinker, which is, I think, one of the main things that drove him to leave ACW and start the one-man crew OMC, so that he could be free to explore his own styles and his own mind and not be, held down by the restrictions or whatever of being in a crew.
Okay.
But definitely into the simple style stuff.
That's cool. And like, I'm curious, like, how did that sort of relationship kind of happen? And would you say that he like mentored you early on?
Yeah, he immediately, was interested in mentoring. He was older than I was. I call him my surrogate dad. He was, I'm not going to claim I know exactly how old he is. I want to say he's maybe close to 10 years older than me.
Okay.
But he might not be that. Might be closer to 6 or 8. But he was definitely older than me and more experienced, and was down to mentor. So yeah, he was. He's an outgoing guy. He's a really charismatic guy. He's a good talker. He's just full of life, and he's one of those guys that magnetizes towards people, and people magnetize towards him. So mentoring was, it was natural and perfect for him.
And what was he like? What did he teach you? Did he like show you some of those styles that he was working on? Was it like a traditional sort of dude bringing you up, or like what was it like? Did he take you bombing? How'd that go down, you and Feski?
He mostly showed me black booking and typography and all those different calligraphy and typography books that he had at Sheldon's. He talked a lot about history and how the lines ran. I mean, that's where I really started to learn about all these other people and these other crews. And Sheldon's was, the bench. Everyone in Chicago who was a writer knew about Feski and knew about Sheldon's, and they would all eventually show up at some point to either swap stickers, buy art supplies, or come and black book.
Wow, really? And so, it wasn't a hardware store. What kind of a store was it? An art store. You said it was an art
store. Yeah, art supplies.
And that became the place where people, like you said, like that was your writer's bench, basically. That's pretty cool. The owners must have been awesome to let something like that kind of happen.
Yeah, the owner of the place was an older guy. He was pretty chill, pretty passive, and oftentimes he wasn't there, or he was in the back and you never saw him, and he just kind of let Feski run the place.
Nice. That's awesome.
Yeah.
So I guess just to like keep moving forward a little bit. So that's 84. And I was actually curious, like, did you draw a lot? I don't know if you still draw. I don't know what your life is like now, but did you draw early on? Were you a black book kind of kid?
Yeah, I always drew. My mom always was putting me in art classes and stuff like that. Even as a young kid, when I would be staying with my aunt or my grandparents or whatever, I never sat idle, and they never liked me just sitting in front of a TV or anything like that. They always, my grandmother was a designer and a real estate agent, and then her husband, my grandfather, was an architect and a builder. Nice. So already they were involved in some kind of art aspect.
Yeah, they sound like
whether
the Eames
commercial art or whatever.
Yeah.
They were still art involved. And oftentimes, I would get gifts and toys or whatever, and it would involve a wood burning tool and pencils and pens and marker sets and stencil sets, that you could draw blueprints to houses with and figure out where the layout of the toilets,
nice.
Just funky stuff like that. But then I would end up using them and make like abstract designs with them and everything like that. So there was always creative indentations going on via my grandparents. And my mom was a hippie, so she was very creative, just a creative, free-minded person. Mm-hmm. So when she would see me taking any interest at all in drawing or whatever, she was constantly finding little art classes here and there, and I would, and it was good for her too, because she was a single mom, and it was almost like daycare. Here I get to drop my kid off for 2 to 4 hours, and I get a slot of my own time, and then I come back and I can pick him up. So I was always doing drawing, always in and out of art classes or whatever. So yeah, I'd been drawing my whole life, and then I discovered comics, as any kid does, and then I'm mimicking all the comics, all of that.
And so you're 15 when you meet Feski. So you're in high school. Was your school? Were there a lot of writers there? Was that happening a lot in that part of Indiana?
No, not. Where my dad was living now was in a small town called Crown Point, which was about a half hour outside of East Chicago. And no, there were not writers. And I would show up, and my outfits were, I guess you could say, were more geared toward urban lifestyle. Yeah. And these guys were all in flannels and jeans and boots.
I mean, were you in like Adidas sweatsuits and Pumas and like Gazelles? Like, were you rocking Kangol?
Oh, yeah.
Like that was you were like full on B-boy going out to the
full on B-boy.
Yeah.
Even at one point, I'll admit it, at one point in my life, I also wore one white glove. I mean,
Nice.
I was primed for an ass beating every time I went to school.
Oh, that's so classic, dude. I'm just like trying to imagine you as a young East, That's brilliant, dude. So 84, when you're with Feski, are your graphics 102? That's your joint. That's who you are at that point.
When I walked into Sheldon's, I was graphics 102. 2 years later, I was East Side, which was shortened to East.
Nice. So in between 85 and 86, when that happened, what was it like? Were you painting a lot at that point? That junior, was that your sophomore, junior year of high school, something like that?
I was painting, not a lot, at least not out in public. There were a couple bridge viaducts that got some visits from me.
Nice.
Things like that, scribbling here and there where I could.
Where were you getting paint?
My dad was kind enough to...
In high school, where were you getting paint from? Like, how was that happening for you?
Oh, we stole it all. There was... Even Walgreens back then had paint. I mean, it was everything. Every place had paint. All the hobby stores had paint. Obviously the hardware stores had paint. You could get paint anywhere.
So you would just rack it all over the place.
That's all we did was constantly steal all of our paint.
Oh, man. I want to see that Walgreens paint. I don't think I've seen those before. So you were racking, and that was just something you also knew to do, or that was like was racking back then the same as it kind of, maybe, I guess it is now with kids? Was it like a real thing, or did you do it purely out of necessity?
Oh, we did it just out of necessity. Like, racking wasn't, it wasn't until later, probably after 86, that racking was a known activity to me.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, before then, it was simply, am I going to go ask my police officer dad, who barely makes any money as, a public servant, for money to spray paint on shit? No, it's not going to happen. So I'm just going to go steal it with my friends.
So you're doing that, and you're painting. You said you had a couple of spots or whatever. I think you said earlier you destroyed the garage. So these are the places where you're kind of starting to hone a craft in a way. And then by 86, you said you came up on. So how did East Side happen? How did that first get introduced?
Well, I started honing my craft really on a spare door that my dad stuck down in the basement that was adjacent to my room and was in the furnace room. And Feski would give me, say, exercises, I guess, connect the dots and doing lines and learning fades and testing out colors and figuring out.
Dude, that's amazing.
Yeah, so I really learned how my can control came really from a spare door in a furnace room in my dad's basement. Wow. I hadn't done a whole lot of pieces. Most of the stuff that I was starting to do under these viaducts or on my dad's garage or whatever was stuff that I was mimicking from the magazine articles and was really mimicking pretty poorly. It was at some point, I don't remember when, but I had tried to reproduce the entire Hell's Kitchen mural by Bill Blass on my dad's side of his garage, with the little red devil and all of that.
Nice.
That Hell's House on it.
Yeah. Wow.
So, I tried to mimic that whole thing. But it was all those exercises finally brought me to a point to where in 1986, Fes said, okay, we're going to tell your mom you're spending the night at my house. We're going to go to my house. We're going to get some paint out of my stash, and I'm going to take you to do your first rooftop.
Nice. And
that's
so
what happened.
That's in 86. And was that in Chicago, this rooftop he was talking about?
Yeah, that was on the south side of Chicago, off of what's called the Douglas B line. I'm not the lines have all changed since I've lived there. I'm not sure if it's called the Douglas B anymore. I think it's just called the Pink. Yeah, so at the California stop, between the California and the Western stop, I believe, if I recall correctly, on the top of a factory facing the Douglas B line.
For people that don't know Chicago at all, can you sort of paint a picture for us of just what the city was like, what the scene was like, and then tell us the story of this first rooftop?
Yeah. So, in the 80s, Chicago is, everyone talks about Chirac now. It's got that great nickname, Chirac.
Yeah.
Chirac isn't half as violent and as dirty and dingy as Chicago was in the 80s. You can imagine every, bad 70s and 80s cop show that you've ever seen. and multiply that by 50. And that's how violent and insane Chicago was in the 80s. I mean, literally everybody walked around with absolute helter-skelter in their eyes, it seems. You know, I don't have a lot of memories of Chicago at that time that didn't or isn't revolved around just insanity and violence. Gang activity was at an all-time high. Drug activity was everywhere. You know, there was constant battles between who was going to be drug lord, and the El Rukins were still involved heavily with the mob and running a lot of drugs and stuff at that time.
Did you still have people in the Hitmen? Is that like you're like affiliated with them?
Yeah, I had a friend who was a runner for the El Rukins, and then obviously, you know, most of us were affiliated with some kind of a gang, albeit folk or people. Folk or people in Chicago is how many of the gangs are divided. And most people, I don't know if they understand what folk and people means. I mean, you can talk about California, you can say Bloods and Crips, and people know what that is.
Yeah.
Folk and people are not two gangs. Folk and people are two divisions of gangs. Within folk, there might be 20 different gangs who claim to be folk. Within people, there could be, you know, another 20 other different gangs who claim to be people. It's very convoluted and confusing. And many gangs identified themselves so subtly that you could find yourself getting jacked or beat up just for having your shoes tied the wrong way. There was not a whole lot of clear understanding of how to present yourself. Whereas, I don't want to act like I'm dumbing down how Bloods and Crips presented themselves, but, you see red, you knew that was a Crip. You saw blue, you knew that was a Blood.
Right.
That wasn't necessarily the way gang activity played out in Chicago. You know, if you wore your hat to one side or if you wore your hat to the other side, you could be claiming a completely different gang.
Right.
It was really convoluted and very confusing.
So you were still associated with the Hitmen, you were saying. And was that something that, like, affected your, like, the way you traveled in Chicago? Did people know that you were associated with them when you went to other neighborhoods?
With the Hitmen?
Yeah.
Did they know if I was affiliated? No, the Hitmen were, in East Chicago, which is right outside of South Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
And though that, through graffiti they were known in Chicago, they actually lived in Indiana in a town that's called East Chicago. Its nickname is called the Harbor. It's where all the steel plants and steel factories and a lot of the train lines would end up.
Okay. It
was a very, very tough, industrial, poor area, and that's where the Hitmen lived. So you didn't necessarily, Hitmen weren't a gang. They were a graffiti and hip hop crew. But
okay.
just by default, they were affiliated with folk because they had to survive in their surroundings.
Okay.
And folk was the most predominant among, their peers and in their area. So that's what they were. But I didn't walk around South Chicago and people wouldn't see me and identify me as a hitman or being affiliated with folk.
Okay.
Simply because, it just wasn't that easy and that blatant.
Okay. And to get back to sort of, because we were talking about sort of, well, you mentioned that, Chicago now is like it fails in comparison to the way Chicago was back then. And that just makes so much sense, especially with like grit and underdevelopment and everything that was happening in the 80s, really in all over the United States, right? What about like the graph scene? Like, so it's interesting. I didn't know that the Hitmen was sort of a hip hop crew. In 86 in Chicago, was there a lot of beef between different graffiti artists?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, there would be in Chicago, there was a huge division. It was the North Side versus the South Side. And the North Side were considered, upper middle class or spoiled white kids, kids who came from the suburbs who were interested in graffiti or hip hop were North Siders. And all of these things are obviously going to be exaggerated descriptions of who these people actually were. I mean, the reality is it doesn't matter if you came from a white family or a rich area or a suburb or whatever. If you had a broken family and you had bad experiences and, if you had a sense of rebellion or whatever, we all still had these same things in common, whether you came from, the deep South Side where you had to live in projects or on the West Side where you had to live in projects and you ate off of food stamps and your milk was in a powdered milk box, like, you know, many of my friends were, the commonality was still that we all had some kind of broken family, broken life, some kind of struggles.
Yeah.
But for whatever reason, Northsiders were always considered upper crust kids and the weaker of, you know, the groups. And the South Side were the tougher, gang-related, keeping it real kids.
Mm-hmm.
And it was always this huge division between the North Side riders and the South Side riders.
So, and were North Siders going to the South Side and South Side going North Side? Were people trying to go like kind of all city, like in other cities at that point? Were you trying to bomb everywhere and that brought more beef?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you know, everybody would, I don't know that there weren't a lot of people who would go to the Deep South Side simply because it was a lot rougher than the North Side. I mean, the North Side definitely had areas where, you know, you had to watch your back, you know, Rogers Park being one of those areas where you had to be careful about what block you were on and what you were doing. But, you know, if you went to the South Side and even, you know, the West Side for that matter, you knew that you were in some sketchy areas and that you had to be on full alert all the time. That necessarily was not the case on the North Side. And as Chi exists today, you know, when I lived pretty centralized between North and South, so I never had to claim a side. Even when I lived in the Streeterville area with my mom, it was pretty run down. There were abandoned buildings. There were a lot of bums around. There were liquor stores and porn shops everywhere. And now if you go to Streeterville, some of the highest, you know, costing real estate in the entire city, and there's nothing but these incredible 5-star restaurants and it completely changed. But the North Side, when you go to the North Side, much of it looks unchanged. It almost feels like the North Side slowly bled its way south into gentrifying a lot of the area.
Same story
and
everywhere.
and it's, you know, and all the violence that people hear about now isn't Chicago proper, because Chicago is crazy safe and it's affluent and there's a ton of people around and activity, and you know, sketchy shit isn't just going to go down.
Right.
But what they did was when they took places like Cabrini Green and, you know, the projects on the West Side, like the Rogers and, you know, all of these places, and gentrified them, they uprooted long-standing gangs and pushed them into opposing territories with other gangs. And then they just started murdering each other at such, you know, incredible rates that all of a sudden everybody's like, everyone's murdering everybody in Chicago. But that's not the case. Like, all these guys have always existed. There's always been a ton of violence, but it's been more widespread in the city and it didn't get reported on. But now that it's becoming these congested areas, and one area might have, you know, 30 murders in that area for that month, it gets reported, and now all of a sudden Chicago's become this horrible center of violence. Yeah. But it's not. It's just it's in very specific areas now, whereas, you know, in the 70s and the 80s, when I was growing up in Chicago, the violence was everywhere. It was so widespread. It was unreal. I mean, I remember being on the North Side at Division over there by the alley, which was a punk rock store. And we used to hang out over there all the time because it was just a heavy, bustling area for kids. There was a 24-hour Dunkin' Donuts on the corner. The one of the main stops for riders was right there. So there was always a bunch of activity. And I remember seeing a gang of skinheads chase a guy into the street, and he got hit by a car, went flying. When he hit, they all surrounded him and started hitting him with sticks and bats and kicking him until he died right there in the street.
Wow, holy shit. Wow.
So, I mean, and I don't remember anybody getting arrested, not a soul. And I remember myself seeing this and, you know, almost being blank-faced. Yeah. Because violence was so predominant and such a steady part of my diet that I was almost unfazed by the activity.
Well, yeah, and that's what happens, right? When it's pervasive like that, we become it becomes normal. It becomes normalized, and we're like, oh, this is just how life is. When it's like, in actuality, no, it should not be this way. But we just see something so many times, it becomes normal. And so was that like a part of, I'm curious, like seeing that kind of violence, like when you were going out with Feski that first night, was that something to take into consideration? Like when you were bombing streets, was that always a consideration at that point?
Yeah, I mean, when Feski and I were walking towards the warehouse on the south side. I mean, it was, you just hoped that you could make it to the warehouse, realistically. You know, you couldn't drive up to the warehouse in that area and just get out of the car, park your car, lock it. You know, you would probably get jacked for your car. So you had to park it away somewhere in a neighborhood. You had to walk like you belonged there and you lived there. If you weren't from that area and someone spotted you, you know, the likelihood was you were going to get rolled or stabbed. I mean, we just hoped that we would make it to the warehouse. You're on pins and needles the whole time. I mean, you're not even thinking about your cans rattling. You're not thinking about, oh, are the police going to roll by and think I'm a writer and are they going to check my bag? Like that was, you know, that would have been easy street.
Yeah.
We would have been happy. We would have been happy if a cop rolled by.
Right.
Worried about the neighborhood itself.
What were the demographics
the warehouse
in that neighborhood? What were the demographics? Like what type of people were living in that area?
Lower middle class and just outright poor. And talking demographics of, you know, extremely mixed individuals, you know, minorities.
Yeah.
You can name 20 different minorities that probably lived in that area.
Okay.
I mean, Chicago was a patchwork of minority spots. I mean, there was Pole Town, Jewtown, you know, Chinatown, whatever. It's just, it didn't matter. You know, Ukrainianville and Wrigleyville. And
right.
It's like, it was so spotted and so much patchwork, and it could go so, you know, block to block that you didn't know exactly, but you knew that this area was riddled with crime. You know, there were broken and boarded up buildings and windows everywhere. There was, you know, gang activity was predominant. You saw gangs marking their territory everywhere. Like I said, you didn't even consider the fact that we might get stopped by the police. You just wanted to be able to make it to the freaking warehouse.
And how long was that walk from where you guys parked to this warehouse?
I'm sure that night it seemed like forever, but I want to say it was only about 2 blocks.
Okay. Yeah. And so was it summer? Was it winter? I'm trying to get like this whole picture painted.
No, it wasn't winter.
Okay.
I think it was late summer, maybe early fall. I remember it being a little chilly.
Did you guys already have like a planned out thing that you were going to paint, or did you just bring like, you know, darks and lights or something so you could do whatever you wanted up there?
No, we went to his house and we dug through his stash, and he had a full plan. He had a self-portrait character. He had a full fest piece planned out with all the colors in a font that he had picked out from one of his, you know, libraries of books.
Okay.
And for me, he basically, I had to make a drawing on the spot. You know, I doodled something at his, and I picked out like Federal Safety Plum, Aqua Turquoise, Pastel Aqua.
It just sounded like it was like nice. It was just like a versatile selection.
Oh, did he have a versatile selection?
Yeah, both of you guys that night with what you were bringing.
He definitely did.
Okay.
I didn't get to choose as much. You know, and a little off subject, he had paint that I wasn't allowed to use. And the seeing his paint at that point is what actually sparked me to become a vintage paint collector, because he had an old Aqua Turquoise that I wasn't able to use. He had pineapple yellow and a baby pink.
Nice.
And yeah, and those colors had already been discontinued. So I wasn't allowed to use those. So that immediately, those were the first vintage cans I ever saw, and that kind of sparked me to seek out more. But no.
That's cool, man. So even in 86, like you guys were like collecting cans and kind of coveting colors. That's awesome.
Yeah. Well, Feski was before me.
Yeah.
And at that point is when I started, and I don't think I ever got anything of any real substance until a couple years later, but I was always, at 86 is when I first saw it, and then I started seeking. By 88, I was full on collecting.
Nice.
Yeah. But anyway, off subject, he only allowed me to pick, you know, from certain areas of his stash, and he seemed to be predominant on the colors that I picked, and he insisted I outline in black. And I had to do, it was a spot big enough for me to do an east piece, but I wasn't allowed to because he was taking me to his spot. He was doing me the favor of taking me out for my first roof on the line.
Yeah.
And I was using his paint. So I had to do his name with my name.
Oh, okay.
So it ended up being an ES-FS wall. ES for East, FS for Fes. And then he went to a totally different wall on the other side of the factory and did this giant, like 30-foot Fes piece with a character and a full background.
Nice. And if I can just back up, let me just back up a little bit. So this warehouse, Feski just knew that, like, had he already painted there? Do you know? Was it a new spot for him, or had he been there?
No, it had been there. There was some stuff there from ACW that was existing, and there was definitely some stuff by Fes already there. And I think I actually went over an old Cindy piece, which was his wife.
Oh, wow.
I think that was underneath the ESFS that I did. And, we didn't have, well, he had buff. I didn't have buff. So I ended up I had to cover up the entire wall first with this striped graphic background before I could even do the letters on top. So I had to fill in my entire background and back then I was just using stock caps.
Wow.
So that was arduous to say the least.
And where did people
do my piece until I filled in the background?
Yeah, and like you said, with a stock cap, that could take forever, especially depending on the consistency of the paint. I'm curious though, did you guys
forever?
Yeah, right. Was the spot you were painting? Could you see it from the L, or could you see it from anywhere? Or did you have to go into the warehouse to know this, to see this spot?
Oh no! He only did on the line.
Nice.
Yeah,
okay.
You could see it. Yeah, you could see it from the Douglas B. He was the Douglas B king, and he wasn't taking any spots that you couldn't see from the line.
Dope. And he was already known and well established by '86. Like, everyone already knew him. You're saying that this warehouse, like ACW cats had already painted it. Feski had some spots up there, and it was seen from the train. Was there? And you had said you were East Side. That's where the ES came from, right? In the wall that you painted. So we didn't even talk about that. Like, how did you get East Side as a tag?
Feski gave it to me because when he met me, I was writing Graphics 102, and I was living downtown in Streeterville with my mom. Streeterville, I mean, there's not an official East Side of Chicago, as you know. The East Side is really the lake. I mean, State Street divides the city, but you've only got a few blocks of east of State Street before you're standing in Lake Michigan.
Right.
Whereas, if you go north, south, or west from State Street, you can go on for miles and miles and miles. So there's no official East Side. But because he lives so far southwest, he always called me East Side. So once Graphics 102 had run its course and we were sitting around trying to figure out what my next name should be, it was his idea, who decided to shorten East Side to just East.
But I
got my name from Feski Fes.
From Feski, but you, like you said, when you still went up on this warehouse that night, the first night you did that roof, you just did an ES piece, which stood for East Side, and then the FS for Feski, right? I'm curious about those letters too, those ES FSs. Did you have to sketch those out and get like approval from Feski? Like, what was the style of them?
Other than absolutely atrocious, they were somewhat structured. I want to say that other than, I have to double back because you had asked me a while ago how I got affiliated and how I met the Hitmen. And I met them when I was at Sheldon's black booking with Fes. I can't remember if Omen Carr was there or if he had just come and gone, and Cato from TDT had just come and gone, or if they were there. But I look out the window and I see, you could spot a rider back then a mile away. They all look like B-boys. They all have skin-tight, skinny jeans. Like, everyone wears skin-tight, skinny jeans now. We were wearing skin-tight, skinny jeans way back in the 80s, just so our shell toes looked so much bigger. We all walked around looking like cartoon characters.
Nice.
We spotted those guys immediately, and I said, who are these guys? And he said, those are the Hitmen from East Chicago. He said, they're an Indiana crew, but they're known all over the city. He's like, you got to meet those guys. So he introduced me to the Hitmen at Sheldon's.
Nice. Okay.
85. So anyway, I started visiting them and getting some influence from Rooster and Ohms as well.
Yeah, you mentioned Rooster before. So Rooster was one of the dudes in the Hitmen.
Yeah, Rooster and Ohms was were the president and vice president, if you were. They were brothers of the Hitman bombing crew. And their house in East Chicago in the basement was like the local bench for their area.
Okay.
So I would go over there and visit with them also in Indiana. It was really just a South Shore train ride away. Or if I was staying at my dad's, you know, it was a 25, 30-minute drive up to Rooster's house over on Euclid. It wasn't that far. So I would say the ESFS that I did was semi-structured piece, more like the New York structured piece, but still with some of the abstract influence I had from Feski and from Rooster. Rooster was very abstract.
And so, like, I'm trying to, like, just because, like, everyone has, I think, like, different definitions for things. So, like, when you talk about structure, can you just elaborate a little bit about that?
Yeah, structure. You know, if a letter is very identifiable and it has direct lines that you can follow, that you like, when you follow those lines, you know that is an S. When you follow those lines, you know that is an R. Whatever, that is structure.
Okay.
But when you paint without a lot of structure, a la Futura 2000 maybe, or A1, John 156, they would do knock even sometimes. You know, these New York guys, they would do letters, but sometimes they were so loose and they were so integrated half in and half out of the background or whatever that they didn't have direct structure. They were more bordering on abstract. I kind of fell somewhere in the middle of that because I had a lot of influences when I was really young by Futura 2000. Then Feski did a lot of abstract wild styles on top of the fact that he liked very simple typography. And then Rooster was very loose, extremely talented. And I never had seen anybody paint quite the way he did. It was very loose, very energetic. And, you know, myself, though, as a grown man, I can now say I'm OCD. As a kid, I didn't know these things, but I liked structure. That's what drew me. You know, I liked things to be precise and structured. But because I was also getting these other abstract influences, I found myself torn and creating something, you know, kind of in the middle for a while. And that's really what that ESFS was. You could see the E, you could see the S, but there were a few weird things with it that maybe wouldn't have made sense.
Okay.
But I felt they belonged because I was caught in that middle area, that gray area between abstract and structure.
And what did the teacher give you as a grade? What did Feski say?
I mean, Feski was pretty hyped.
Nice.
Yeah. Because, you know, he was only doing pretty much fonts at that time. He had stopped doing wild styles. He would still do wild styles in his black books, and when he was airbrushing, he did a lot of airbrushing. But when it came to doing graffiti and pieces, he was just doing simples and very readable stuff because that's what he wanted. When I did the ESFS, and he saw that it was kind of, you know, this mix between him and myself, whatever. It was just, it didn't look like his, so he was excited about that, but it had enough structure to look like something, you know?
Yeah,
I could have gone up there and just done a huge mess and wasted all of his paint, and he would have been like, okay, you know, you got the experience, but now you've completely wasted all my paint. You got to go rack me some more. But I actually did 2 decent pieces, and he liked them. He enjoyed them, and he let them run.
Nice. And
so yeah, he was pretty hyped on them.
And how were you? I mean, you must have been hyped too. Then, I mean, this is your first time doing a roof. You're doing it with a dude who's already kind of a legend. I mean, that must have felt. Actually, how did it feel?
Yeah, that was a big deal, bro. I mean, yeah, I still grin. I'm grinning right now. I mean, I grin ear to ear just thinking about that.
Absolutely.
I'll never capture that moment again in my life, you know?
Yeah, I mean, always chasing that dragon, you know? And so, and, you know, actually, I mean, I'm curious that after the ESFS, you told us that Feski then told you at some point, I don't know, you can tell us how long, that he said, now you're east. How did that go down, and why did he cut off the side? Just,
you know, too long. It was just, I remember him saying specifically, like, you know, keep it short. 4 letters, 3 letters are preferred, actually. I mean, a 4-letter back then, you know, 3 letters were even preferred. So I had 3-letter names too on reserve because it was all about getting up and being able to do things quickly. So 4 letters was kind of pushing the envelope. But he said, four is a good name. East is good letters. We don't need to do the East Side. That's my nickname for you, but that doesn't need to be your graffiti tag. So East was appropriate.
I mean, like what it's a pretty strong, it's a pretty like kind of dominant name. And I always had wondered like if there was another East, and I mean, had you ever heard of another East, or have you since?
Oh yeah, at least half a dozen.
Mm-hmm. Were any of them reputable? Did any of them really put in work?
I'm going to say no. Salt people,
exactly. Yeah.
I think there are Easts that were more predominant maybe for their area or had predominance in their area. Mm-hmm. One that comes to mind is E3 is what he calls himself now, but it was East out of Hawaii. And he was well known in, I guess, his circles in Hawaii and on the West Coast, maybe even in LA.
Okay.
But there were other ones. In fact, I did a piece at the CTA competition, and I wrote out a scroll and I shouted out a bunch of guys who wrote East and said, I'm the original. I've got the fame, so I keep the name, kind of a thing.
Nice.
And I've been fortunate enough that I have still, at this point, come before all of them.
Yeah. Well, I mean, dude, b-boying since 78, man. I'm like, damn, dude.
Yeah.
Respect, bro.
And I don't know when they started b-boying or whatever, but I'm lucky enough that I was actually physically writing the name East before any of them.
Yeah, and so I'm curious. Well, actually, you said something about the letters. I've had a lot of people in these interviews say that they chose their name, especially with random names that aren't really real names, but they just chose it because they liked the letters. When you had EAST, were you like looking at those going, oh yeah, like I can work with those? Or did you have... Was it a struggle? Like, what was your experience with those letters?
I want to say that I felt like they came pretty natural. I mean, before that I was working with I's and F's and X's in graphics and, way too many letters and trying to figure out how to incorporate a 102 into it at the end. And,
yes.
Just a clusterfuck of letters and numbers.
Yeah.
So, yeah, to be able to approach something of such quality as an E, an A, an S, and a T, yeah, that was a big relief. I felt pretty at home with that.
Dope. And which is also like kind of a cool thing. I mean, a lot of the writers that I know that have been painting for a long time, they're young. It keeps you young, I believe, just staying active and keeping this thing going. And so, I mean, one of the things that I often will end on also is I like to ask people to just tell the listeners like where they can find your art, find your store, your website. Can you just give us some of your handles and information real quick?
Yeah. So they can find me on Instagram. That's really where I do the most of my posting. And it's East1, the number 1, but there is an underscore after every letter and before the 1.
So E_A _. Yeah. Okay.
East 1. East is kind of a generic word out in the stratosphere in the internet. So I had to do all those underscores in order to be able to keep my name. So it's East and the number 1, but then there's an underscore between each letter.
Okay.
So find me on Instagram. And then for my business, it's Cypher Urban Arts on Instagram also. And I'm located just south of downtown Denver. We don't do online sales, but if you physically want to come into the shop, we're right on Broadway. It's the biggest thoroughfare through the city, so it's hard to miss.
Yeah, it is, man. And it's a great shop. And when because I guess it was 2000, I think, 13 or 14 when I was out there and I got to see you in the shop, and it's a great spot. It's a great space, and congrats on all that success. And it's like I said, there's so many other things that we can talk about. So hopefully we'll get into a part 2 down the road. But again, want to thank you. And again, today we were talking with East, and thanks for being here, dude.
Yeah, thank you so much, man.
You have been listening to My Life in Letters, a podcast dedicated at documenting the experiences of graffiti artists. Our producer is UziEgo. Our intern is Max Braithwaite, and my name is Adam Fujita.